She watched him every morning, hunched over that broom, invisible to everyone rushing past. For 6 months, she shared her lunch with him. A simple sandwich, split down the middle. He never asked for it, never expected it. But on a cold Tuesday morning, when that black limousine pulled up to the curb and he stepped out wearing a $1,000 suit, she realized she'd been feeding someone who could have bought her entire neighborhood. Who was he really? And why had he been sweeping these streets in the first place? Margaret Walsh had taught 5th grade for 32 years in Riverside, Ohio. A town where everyone knew everyone, where secrets didn't stay buried for long, and where kindness was still considered currency. She'd retired 3 years earlier, after her husband Thomas died from a heart attack in their living room while watching the evening news. The doctors said it was sudden, painless, but Margaret knew better. She'd seen the stress eating away at him for months before. The way his hands trembled when he opened the bills. The way he'd stare at his computer screen late into the night. His face pale in the blue light. Thomas had worked in accounting at Henderson & Associates, a mid-sized financial firm downtown. He never talked much about his work, said it was boring, number crunching, nothing she'd find interesting. Now he was gone, and she was left with a paid-off house, a small pension, and a routine that felt hollow. Every morning at 7:15, Margaret walked 3 blocks to Rosie's Diner on Main Street. She'd order the same thing, 2 turkey sandwiches on wheat bread, 1 coffee black, 1 orange juice. She'd eat half of 1 sandwich there at the counter, reading the local paper, then wrap up the rest along with the second sandwich to take home. Except she never took them home, because that's when she started noticing him. The street sweeper. He worked the same 4-block stretch every single day, wearing faded blue coveralls and a Cincinnati Reds cap pulled low over his face. Most people walked right past him like he was part of the scenery, just another piece of municipal equipment doing its job. But Margaret noticed the way he moved, careful and deliberate. The way he'd pause sometimes and just stare at the buildings like he was remembering something. She noticed he never ate lunch, never took a break, just kept sweeping. So one morning in late March, she walked up to him and held out half her sandwich. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes a startling pale blue under the shadow of that cap. Weathered face mapped with lines that spoke of years lived hard. He hesitated, like he wasn't sure if this was real or some kind of test. Then he took it, nodded once, and said in a voice rough from disuse, "Thank you, ma'am." That was it. No conversation. No exchange of names. Just a simple transaction of human decency. And it became their routine. Every morning, Margaret brought 2 sandwiches, kept 1 for herself, gave 1 to him. Sometimes she tried to talk to him, ask how his day was going, comment on the weather. He'd nod, offer short responses, never more than necessary. "Fine, thank you. Storm's coming. Have a good day, ma'am." The other regulars at Rosie's thought she was wasting her time. Doris, who worked the morning shift, told her flat out, "Honey, that man don't want conversation. He's got his reasons for keeping to himself." But Margaret didn't do it for conversation. She did it because after Thomas died, after sitting alone in that house night after night, she understood what it felt like to be invisible. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. His name, or at least the name he gave when pressed, was Ben Miller. That's what it said on his work badge from the city's sanitation department. That's what the other workers called him on the rare occasions they crossed paths. But Ben Miller was a ghost. No social media presence. No family anyone knew about. No address listed in the city directory beyond a P.O. box. He'd appeared in Riverside 18 months earlier, walked into the Department of Public Works, filled out an application in neat, precise handwriting, and started the next Monday. He was reliable, never missed a shift, never complained, never caused problems. He was the kind of employee supervisors loved because he required absolutely no management. Just pointed him at a street, and he cleaned it better than anyone else on the crew. But there were odd things about Ben Miller if you paid attention, and Margaret was paying attention. His hands, for instance. They were callous now from months of manual labor, but she'd noticed early on they had the look of hands that once did different work. Slender fingers, neatly trimmed nails despite the grime, a certain elegance in how he held things. The way he spoke, too. When he did say more than a few words, his grammar was perfect, his vocabulary more sophisticated than you'd expect from someone who'd supposedly been doing manual labor his whole life. And then there was the watch. She'd only glimpsed it once when his sleeve rode up as he reached for the sandwich. It was nice, really nice. The kind of timepiece that cost more than most people in Riverside made in 6 months. When she'd mentioned it, asked if it was a family heirloom, he'd pulled his sleeve down quickly and changed the subject. 6 months into their daily routine, something shifted. It was a Thursday in early September, unseasonably cool for Ohio, leaves just starting to turn. Margaret mentioned casually that she'd been going through Thomas's old things, finally sorting through boxes she'd avoided for 3 years. She mentioned he'd worked in finance, had been good with numbers, had always made sure they were secure, even if the job stressed him out. Ben stopped eating mid-bite, just froze, staring at his sandwich like it had personally offended him. "Your husband worked at Henderson and Associates?" he asked, and his voice had an edge to it she'd never heard before. "How did you know that?" Margaret asked, surprised. "I never mentioned the firm." Ben stood up abruptly, wrapped the remainder of his sandwich, and said, "I should get back to work. Thank you for lunch." He walked away before she could respond. And for the first time in 6 months, he didn't meet her eyes. The next morning, he wasn't there. His section of Main Street sat unswept, leaves gathering in the gutters, coffee cups and newspaper pages tumbling in the wind. Margaret waited at their usual spot for 20 minutes, sandwich growing soggy in her hands, before finally walking home. He wasn't there Friday either. Or Monday. By Tuesday, she was worried enough to call the Department of Public Works. The woman who answered said Ben Miller had called in sick. Nothing to worry about. He'd be back when he felt better. But something about the way she said it felt rehearsed, like she'd been told exactly what to say if anyone asked. Wednesday morning, Margaret was sitting in Rosie's, staring at her coffee, when Doris slid a folded piece of paper across the counter. "Someone left this for you," she said. "Tall guy, wearing a baseball cap. Came in before dawn, told me to make sure you got it." Margaret unfolded the paper with trembling hands. The handwriting was the same precise script she'd seen on Ben's work badge that one time she'd gotten close enough to read it. It said only, "Thank you for seeing me when no one else did. Some debts can't be repaid with money. Be careful who you trust, Margaret. Not everyone in Riverside is who they claim to be. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos." Margaret didn't sleep that night. She sat in Thomas's old office, the room she'd avoided for 3 years, and started going through his files. At first, she wasn't sure what she was looking for. Just a feeling gnawing at her gut that something connected her dead husband to the man who'd been sweeping their streets. Thomas had been meticulous, kept every receipt, every bank statement, every work document in carefully labeled folders. Most of it was exactly what she'd expected: boring financial reports, client portfolios, tax documents. But in the back of his filing cabinet, behind a stack of old golf magazines, she found a folder that didn't match the others. It was unlabeled, sealed with packing tape, and when she opened it, photographs spilled out across the desk. They were surveillance photos, grainy, taken from a distance, some clearly shot through car windows. They showed a man in an expensive suit getting out of a black Mercedes, entering the Henderson and Associates building, meeting with other men in what looked like a parking garage. Margaret's breath caught because she recognized the man in the suit. Older in these photos, more polished, different haircut, clean-shaven, but those pale blue eyes were unmistakable. It was Ben, or whoever Ben really was. Beneath the photos were printed emails, correspondence between Thomas and someone named Jennifer Valdez at the Securities and Exchange Commission. Thomas had been documenting something, tracking financial irregularities at his own firm, suspicious transfers, shell companies, money disappearing from client accounts and reappearing in offshore holdings. And the name that appeared over and over in his notes was Benjamin Cole, senior partner at Henderson and Associates, the golden boy who'd built his reputation on aggressive growth strategies and guaranteed returns that seemed too good to be true. Because they were. Thomas's final email to Jennifer Valdez was dated 2 days before he died. "I have everything we need," he wrote. "Cole has been running a Ponzi scheme for at least 5 years, maybe longer. I can prove it. Client money is gone. He's been paying old investors with new investor money, and it's about to collapse. I'm going to confront him tomorrow, give him a chance to come clean before I turn this over to you. He was my friend once. I owe him that much." Margaret felt ice spreading through her chest. Thomas hadn't died of natural causes. Or if he had, the timing was convenient enough to make anyone suspicious. She kept digging through the files and found Thomas's personal journal, entries spanning the last 6 months of his life. The stress she'd noticed hadn't been about bills or retirement planning. It had been about this, about discovering his colleague and friend was a criminal, about the weight of deciding whether to destroy a man's life even if that man deserved it. "I confronted Ben today," read an entry from 3 days before Thomas died. He denied everything at first, then broke down. Said he'd made mistakes early on, tried to cover them, and it snowballed. Said he'd fix it. "I told him he had 1 week to come clean or I was going to the SEC myself. He looked at me like I'd killed him. Said I was the only real friend he'd ever had. I don't know what to do anymore." Margaret's hands were shaking so badly she could barely turn the pages. The final entry was written the morning Thomas died. "Ben called me last night, 3 in the morning, drunk or crying or both. Said he was sorry, said he never meant for it to get this bad. Said if I turned him in, he'd lose everything. His family would be destroyed. He'd go to prison for the rest of his life. Asked me if our friendship meant anything. I told him friendship doesn't mean protecting someone from the consequences of hurting innocent people. He hung up on me. I'm going to send everything to Jennifer today. I can't carry this anymore. God forgive me, but I can't protect him from himself." Thomas had died that evening. The files were never sent. And 6 months later, Benjamin Cole had disappeared. Margaret went to the police the next morning. She brought the folder, the photographs, Thomas's journal, everything. The detective who took her statement was a tired-looking man in his 50s, named Frank Morrison, who listened patiently, took notes, and told her he'd look into it. She could tell from his tone he thought she was a grieving widow seeing conspiracies where there were none. "Mrs. Walsh," he said gently, "your husband died of a heart attack. The medical examiner was very clear about that. And Benjamin Cole, well, that's a complicated situation. But it's being handled by federal authorities. I appreciate you bringing this in, but I'm not sure there's anything here that changes what we already know." Margaret leaned forward, her voice harder than she'd intended. "What do we already know, detective? Because from where I'm sitting, my husband discovered a massive fraud, was about to report it, and died the same day. And the man he was going to report is now sweeping streets under a fake name in the same town where this all happened. That doesn't strike you as strange?" Morrison shifted in his chair, uncomfortable now. "Benjamin Cole disappeared 14 months ago," he said carefully. "The FBI has an active warrant out for him. If the man you've been giving sandwiches to really is Cole, and I'm not saying it is, but if it is, then we need to proceed very carefully. These kinds of cases, when they involve this much money, people get hurt." He pulled out his phone, scrolled through something, then turned the screen toward her. It showed a professional headshot of a man in his late 40s, dark hair slicked back, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Margaret's car. He was smiling, confident, the kind of smile that sold trust to wealthy clients. The caption read, "Benjamin Cole, partner, Henderson and Associates, managing director of private wealth." Margaret stared at the photo. then at the detective. "That's him," she said quietly. "That's the man who's been sweeping Main Street for the past 6 months." The next 48 hours turned Riverside inside out. Federal agents descended on the town like locusts. Black SUVs with government plates parking outside Rosie's diner. Agents in suits interviewing everyone who'd ever spoken to Ben Miller. They searched his apartment, a tiny studio above the hardware store that the owner said Ben paid for in cash every month. Always on time. Never caused trouble. Inside, they found almost nothing. A mattress on the floor. One change of clothes. A few books. And a photograph of a woman and 2 teenage boys that someone would later identify as Cole's ex-wife and sons, taken before everything fell apart. No money. No documents. No indication of where the missing millions might be. It was like he'd been living as a ghost deliberately, stripping away every piece of the man he used to be, until only the most essential parts remained. The media arrived next. News vans from Cleveland and Columbus. Reporters shoving microphones in people's faces, asking what it was like to have a fugitive hiding in plain sight. Doris gave an interview saying Ben had always been polite, always said thank you. Seemed like a decent guy who'd fallen on hard times. One of the other sanitation workers told a reporter that Ben was the hardest worker he'd ever seen. Never complained, even when they stuck him with the worst routes. And Margaret. They were especially interested in Margaret, the woman who'd shared her lunch with a conman. They made it sound like a moral failing, like she'd been naive or foolish. One reporter asked her on camera, "Did you feel betrayed when you found out who he really was?" She'd looked directly into the camera and said, "I feel betrayed that a good man died trying to do the right thing, and everyone seems more interested in the criminal than the victim." But here's what the media didn't know. What Margaret hadn't told the police, because she wasn't sure if it mattered. 2 days after the federal agents arrived, she received another note. It was slipped under her door in the middle of the night. And this time there was no mistaking the handwriting. "I didn't kill Thomas," it said. "But I know who did. And if you want the truth, stop talking to the police. They're asking the wrong questions about the wrong crime. Your husband was murdered, Margaret. And the person who ordered it is still walking free in this town, wearing a badge of respectability, while I rot in the gutter. If you trusted me enough to share your lunch, trust me enough to listen. Thursday, midnight, the old rail bridge outside town. Come alone or don't come at all. You deserve to know what Thomas died for." Margaret held that note for 3 hours, sitting in her kitchen, weighing every option. This could be a trap. Ben Cole was a proven liar, a man who'd stolen millions from people who trusted him. But he was also the man who'd said thank you every morning for 6 months, who'd worked an honest job when he could have run anywhere in the world, who'd somehow known things about Thomas that no one else did. Thursday night, Margaret told no one where she was going. She drove her old Honda Civic out past the town limits, down the county road that paralleled the abandoned railway line, and parked near the old steel bridge that hadn't seen a train in 20 years. The moon was nearly full, bright enough to cast long shadows through the skeletal framework of the bridge. She walked out to the middle, her footsteps echoing on the wooden planks, and waited. For 15 minutes there was nothing but the sound of wind through tall grass and the distant hoot of an owl. Then she heard footsteps behind her. She turned and there he was, Ben Cole, wearing the same faded coveralls and Red's cap, but somehow looking different now that she knew who he really was. He stopped 10 feet away, keeping distance between them, hands visible at his sides in a gesture of non-threat. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said, and his voice carried clearly in the quiet night. "Thank you for that, for trusting me one more time." Margaret crossed her arms, keeping her expression neutral even though her heart was hammering. "I didn't come here because I trust you, Mr. Cole. I came because my husband is dead, and I need to know why. You said he was murdered. Prove it." Ben nodded slowly, like he'd expected nothing less. "Thomas was the best man I ever knew," he said quietly. "The only person at that firm who gave a damn about anything other than profit margins and quarterly bonuses. When I started down the path, I went down, making promises I couldn't keep, moving money around to cover earlier mistakes. He was the one person I knew would eventually catch me. Part of me wanted him to. Does that make sense? I was drowning, Margaret. Every day digging the hole deeper. And I couldn't stop because stopping meant admitting what I'd done. He walked closer, slowly, until he was only a few feet away. She could see his face clearly now, see the exhaustion etched into every line, the haunted quality in those pale blue eyes. Thomas figured it out about 8 months before he died, Ben continued. He came to me privately, told me he knew what I'd been doing, gave me a chance to fix it before he reported it. I tried. God, I tried. But there was no fixing it. The money was gone, Margaret. $73 million, invested in bad deals and phantom companies, paid out to early investors to keep the illusion going. I'd stolen from over 200 families, destroyed retirement accounts, college funds, medical savings. And your husband, the man who'd been my friend for 15 years, was going to make sure I faced consequences for that, as he should have. Margaret felt tears burning her eyes but refused to let them fall. Then what are you doing here? Why are you telling me this? If you're guilty, if Thomas was right about you, then you deserve to be in prison. You stole people's futures. Ben's jaw tightened. I did, he said flatly. And I should be in prison. But that's not why Thomas is dead. 3 days before he died, he came to my office after hours. We were alone. He told me he was sending everything to the SEC the next day, that our friendship was over, that he hoped I'd find some shred of decency and turn myself in before they came for me. I was angry, drunk, said terrible things I'll regret for the rest of my life. We argued. I told him he was throwing away our friendship for nothing, that the people we worked with would eat him alive for being a rat. He looked at me with such disappointment and said, "The only rat in this building is you, Ben. And I'm done protecting you." He paused, swallowing hard, and Margaret realized he was fighting tears of his own. He walked out. I sat in my office for another hour, drinking, feeling sorry for myself. Then my phone rang. It was Richard Henderson, our senior partner, Thomas's direct supervisor. He asked me to come to his office. When I got there, he was sitting behind his desk, calm as Sunday morning, and he said, "We have a problem, Benjamin. Thomas Walsh has assembled a very detailed case against you, and by extension, against this firm. If he goes to the authorities, we're all finished. Not just you, all of us. The firm collapses, the lawsuits destroy us, we all go to prison. That's unacceptable." I told him there was nothing I could do, that Thomas had made up his mind. And Richard smiled at me, this cold, empty smile, and said, "Then we'll have to change his mind, or make sure he can't share what he knows." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. "What are you saying?" Ben met her eyes directly. "I'm saying Richard Henderson had your husband killed, Margaret. I don't know exactly how, maybe bribed the medical examiner, maybe had someone induce the heart attack. I don't know the details. But 2 days after that conversation, Thomas was dead. And a week later, Richard called me into his office again and told me the problem was solved, that I needed to disappear for a while until things cooled down, that the firm would take care of me if I kept my mouth shut. I refused. Told him I was going to the police, was going to tell them everything. He laughed at me, said who would believe a con man over a respected financial advisor with 30 years of sterling reputation. Said if I tried to implicate him, he'd make sure I went down for Thomas's murder too, that he had enough evidence planted to make it look like I'd ordered the hit to silence a witness. "So you ran," Margaret said. "And it wasn't a question." Ben nodded. "I ran, emptied what little clean money I had left, created the Ben Miller identity, and disappeared. I thought about leaving Ohio entirely, starting over somewhere far away. But I couldn't. Because Thomas deserved better than what he got, and his widow deserved to know the truth. So I came back to Riverside, took a job where no one would look twice at me, and I watched. I watched Richard Henderson continue running that firm, presenting himself as the stable hand after the scandal, taking interviews about how he'd had no idea what I was doing, playing the victim. I watched him at Thomas's funeral, shaking your hand, offering condolences, all while knowing he'd ordered your husband's death. And every day I swept these streets, I thought about how to make it right." Margaret was shaking now, rage and grief and confusion warring inside her. If this is true, if any of this is true, why didn't you tell someone? Why didn't you go to the police? The FBI? Anyone? Ben's laugh was bitter. With what evidence? Everything I had implicated me, not Henderson. He's too smart for that. He doesn't send emails, doesn't leave paper trails. Everything goes through intermediaries. Verbal agreements, plausible deniability. And I'm a fugitive, a con man, a thief. My testimony is worthless. But yours isn't, Margaret. If you start asking the right questions, if you push the authorities to look deeper at Thomas's death, at the firm's financials after I disappeared, at Henderson's sudden promotion to managing partner, and the convenient way certain client accounts were quietly closed and restructured, maybe someone will listen. Maybe Thomas can get justice. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Margaret drove home in a daze, Ben's words echoing in her head. She didn't sleep. Instead, she sat at her kitchen table and made a list. She wrote down every name Thomas had mentioned working with, every client dinner they'd attended, every odd comment he'd made about office politics in those final months. She wrote down dates, times, inconsistencies in the official story of his death. The more she wrote, the more patterns emerged. Richard Henderson had visited their house twice in the month before Thomas died, ostensibly for friendly check-ins, but Thomas had been agitated after both visits. The life insurance policy had paid out suspiciously fast, processed in less than 3 weeks when most claims took months, and Henderson himself had been the one to suggest she use a specific financial advisor to manage the payout, someone who coincidentally worked at Henderson and Associates. She thought about the man she'd shared lunch with for 6 months, the quiet street sweeper who always said thank you, who worked with dignity even in the lowest circumstances. Was that an act? A manipulation? Or was that who Benjamin Cole really was beneath the lies he'd told to cover earlier lies? She thought about Thomas, her husband of 34 years, the man who'd valued integrity above everything, who'd chosen to do the right thing even when it cost him friendships and maybe his life. What would Thomas want her to do now? The answer came to her clearly. Thomas would want the truth, no matter how ugly, no matter where it led. The next morning, Margaret didn't go to the police. She went to Jennifer Valdez, at the SEC, the woman Thomas had been corresponding with before he died. Jennifer was younger than Margaret expected, early 30s, sharp-eyed and skeptical when Margaret introduced herself and explained why she was there. But as Margaret laid out everything, Thomas's files, Ben Cole's accusations, the timeline of events around Thomas's death, Jennifer's skepticism shifted to focused attention. "I remember your husband," Jennifer said quietly. "He reached out to us 9 months ago with preliminary concerns about Henderson and Associates. We were building a case, but then he died and the information stopped coming. We eventually shifted focus to just Benjamin Cole as an isolated incident, because that's what the evidence supported. But if what you're telling me is accurate, if Henderson was involved in both a fraud and a potential homicide, that changes everything." Over the following weeks, Jennifer and her team descended on Riverside, with subpoenas and forensic accountants. They pulled records that Henderson thought were buried, interviewed people who'd been too afraid to speak up before, followed money trails that led to shell companies and offshore accounts that made Benjamin Cole's fraud look like petty theft in comparison. Henderson had been skimming from client accounts for over a decade, and when Thomas and Ben's actions threatened to expose him, he'd orchestrated an elaborate cover-up that pinned everything on Cole, while eliminating the only witness who could contradict his story. The medical examiner who'd signed off on Thomas's death as natural causes suddenly remembered being pressured to expedite the autopsy, to not run certain tests, to accept the obvious explanation rather than dig deeper. Phone records showed calls between Henderson and a private security consultant with a history of corporate espionage and rumored connections to less legal services. The arrest came on a Tuesday morning. Federal agents took Richard Henderson into custody as he arrived at the Henderson and Associates building, led him out in handcuffs while news cameras caught every second. Charges included wire fraud, securities fraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit murder. Margaret watched it on the news from her living room, and for the first time since Thomas died, she cried. Not from grief, but from a complicated mixture of relief and rage and exhaustion. Justice, she was learning, didn't make the pain go away. It just gave it a different shape. Ben Cole turned himself in 3 days after Henderson's arrest. He walked into the FBI field office in Cleveland with a lawyer who'd agreed to represent him pro bono after hearing his story. He pleaded guilty to securities fraud, wire fraud, and multiple counts of theft. But he also testified against Henderson, providing details of conversations and decisions that corroborated the evidence Jennifer's team had assembled. The prosecutor offered him a deal, 12 years instead of 30, credit for cooperation, and the time he'd already spent living as a fugitive in poverty. He took it. At his sentencing hearing, he asked permission to make a statement. The judge allowed it. "I stole millions of dollars from people who trusted me," Ben said, standing before a courtroom packed with his former clients, many of whom had lost everything because of his decisions. "I told myself I could fix it, that I was borrowing, not stealing, that I'd make everyone whole eventually. Those were lies I told myself to avoid facing what I'd become. I destroyed families. I ruined retirements. I caused suffering that can't be measured in dollars. And when my friend, a good man named Thomas Walsh, tried to stop me from hurting more people, I was too much of a coward to support him. I let another man manipulate my crimes into something even worse. I can't undo any of it. I can't give those years back. Can't restore what was lost. All I can do is accept responsibility and spend whatever time I have left trying to be the person Thomas believed I could be, even when I couldn't see it myself." Margaret was there. She sat in the back row, watching this man who'd swept her streets and eaten her sandwiches, now standing in an orange jumpsuit, accepting consequences for the damage he'd caused. When the hearing ended and they led him away, he caught her eye for just a moment. He nodded, a small gesture of recognition and goodbye. She nodded back. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly. But it was acknowledgement that people were more complicated than the worst things they'd done, that someone could be both a criminal and a man who said thank you every morning. That justice and mercy didn't have to be opposites. 6 months later, on a cold morning in early spring, Margaret walked to Rosie's diner like she'd done hundreds of times before. She ordered 2 turkey sandwiches on wheat bread, 1 coffee black, 1 orange juice. Doris raised an eyebrow but didn't comment, just rang up the order like always. Margaret ate half of 1 sandwich at the counter, reading the paper, then wrapped up the rest along with the second sandwich. But this time, instead of looking for a street sweeper who wasn't there anymore, she walked 3 blocks to the public library, where she now volunteered on Thursdays. In the back corner, near the biographies, an elderly homeless man named Marcus sat every morning, reading newspapers and pretending he was there for the books rather than the warmth. Margaret had noticed him a few weeks earlier, noticed how he tried to be invisible, how he carefully put every paper back exactly where he'd found it, how he never asked for anything. She walked up and held out the sandwich. Marcus looked at her, surprised and cautious. The same expression Ben had worn 2 years earlier. "Thought you might be hungry," Margaret said simply. "No strings attached, just lunch." Marcus hesitated, then took the sandwich with trembling hands. "Thank you, ma'am," he said quietly, his voice rough but genuine. "You don't know what this means." Margaret smiled, feeling Thomas's presence like a warm hand on her shoulder, feeling the weight of the past 2 years settling into something she could carry. "Actually," she said, "I think I do." "So what do you think? Was Benjamin Cole a villain who happened to do 1 decent thing? Or a broken man who found his humanity again in the simplest way possible? Was Margaret naive for sharing her lunch with a stranger? Or was she the only one wise enough to see that kindness doesn't require perfect judgment, just consistent action? Here's what I know for certain. Thomas Walsh died trying to do the right thing in a world that punished him for it. Richard Henderson spent decades hiding behind respectability while destroying lives. And somewhere in a federal prison in Ohio, a man who once stole millions now works in the library, helping other inmates prepare for their GED exams, trying to repay a debt that can never be fully settled. Sometimes the people we help aren't who we think they are. Sometimes kindness is wasted on those who don't deserve it. But sometimes, just sometimes, a sandwich shared on a cold morning can change the trajectory of a life, can remind someone that they're still human even when they've forgotten how to be. Would you have shared your lunch with Ben Cole if you'd known who he really was? Would you have walked away? Tell me in the comments below what you would have done. And if this story made you think about the people you pass on the street every day, the ones we've trained ourselves not to see, then maybe that's exactly the point Thomas Walsh died trying to make. Be kind anyway, not because people deserve it, but because you do. Subscribe for more true stories that prove reality is always stranger and more complicated than we want to believe.